Hello everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us here today for a very, very special event with visual artist Igshaan Adams. I'm delighted to be, I think, the third event in the Green Room series, which is a really special series focused on artists and performers and creatives who are especially close to the Southbank Centre and to the Hayward Gallery, in conversation with Southbank Centre's own programmers and curators. So I'm just going to get started now on a kind of very brief introduction to Igshaan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for everybody for wanting to know more about my practice. And hopefully, I can give you everybody an insight on my own life and my lived experiences and how that informs my practice and what I'm concerned with within this body of work.
Igshaan, I'm going to actually introduce you with a brief biography, which I feel really doesn't do justice, but I hope can give people an idea of the kind of projects that you've worked on in the past and what you've got coming up, but also a nice kind of research fodder for people as well if they're interested in looking up images of your work. So Igshaan Adams, born in 1982, lives and works in Cape Town, South Africa. Igshaan's cross-disciplinary practice covers weaving, sculpture, and installation, exploring concerns related to his upbringing in South Africa and issues around race, religion, and sexuality. To date, Igshaan has had 9 solo exhibitions around the world, including at SCAD Museum of Art in Savannah, Arkesjes Kunstcenter in Oslo, and Blank Projects in Cape Town. He has also participated in numerous group shows, both locally and internationally. Most recently, these include Who Are We Who at Brownsveld in Cologne, and Allied with Power at Perez Art Museum, Miami, both in 2022, Mapping Black Identities at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 2019, Material Insanity at the Museum of African Contemporary Art, Almada in 2019, and This Imperfect Present Moment at the Seattle Art Museum in 2018. In 2022, Igshaan will present a major solo exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. And Igshaan is represented by 2 fantastic galleries who have provided us with so much support throughout his process of planning a show in London, which are Blank Projects in Cape Town and Casey Kaplan Gallery in New York. And Igshaan is actually opening a show at Casey Kaplan Gallery in New York just before he opens with us in May at the Hayward Gallery. So he's had an incredibly busy time of late.
Yeah. On the 1st of May, well, I'm not complaining. It's been amazing. It's been an amazing time and very productive. But thank you for that really beautiful, really nice introduction.
Oh, you're welcome, Igshaan. So I wondered if we could just start today, like almost right at the beginning, you know, and maybe you could tell our audience today a little bit about actually how you became an artist and how this journey really started for you.
Well, you might have to stop me if I speak too much.
No, go for it. Freestyle with it.
Well, I think there's actually a little interesting story that I could tell you about right at the beginning. So I grew up in Cape Town, like you said, during the apartheid years, you know, so it was a very different kind of environment back then. And I think it's difficult to understand how really strange and crazy that environment was back then. But in terms of education, there was really no art for me in my education process, right? This was the education system was set up for different race groups to kind of specifically to function in that very narrow corridor that each group could function in, you know. So for someone of my race, which would have been second class citizen, a manager's position would be like the top you could aim for, things like this. So your education would be in line. Anyway, so art was completely absent from my earlier life, other than my father drawing portraits of us, or my aunt allowing us to draw on the walls in our bedroom, and she drawing, and my own bedroom was always filled with pictures and drawings and writings and and just accumulated over time. So we had that freedom growing up, and I grew up in a very creative, or I should say, a very crafty family who was also involved in church and Sunday school specifically. So I got to kind of be involved in that side. But it was really after high school when there was the small community college that visited our school and introduced art as a possibility to me for the first time. But my family had no money. There was nothing. And so I worked for 6 months and saved money just to apply with no bursary, no funds. But I was curious whether or not I would be accepted in this kind of school. And I was accepted, but knowing I could never study, there was just no possibility. But I went through the process as if there was money. And on the very first day of school, when I'm supposed to now start school, my aunt came to me and gave me a check for 80% of my first 6 months and said, this is just to get you started. For the rest, you'll have to work and find bursaries and everything else.
Wow.
And that's what I needed.
First patron in a way.
Yes. So this is how it started. And in fact, I applied for hospitality studies, not art. But it was way too expensive. Art was like, in fact, back then it was the equivalent of like £100 for 6 months. It sounds like nothing, but at the time it was a crazy amount for me. But yeah, I kind of got into art by default. I wanted to be in hospitality, and studied graphic design and did painting as the second subject. After studying my first study, I became a gardener with that qualification. And I was a gardener for about 10 years before ultimately there was a workshop. So I was still painting, and I always carried pictures of my work, physical photographs printed out everywhere I went in this little booklet that I had made, and just to show people, because I thought you never know. And then one day I met the woman who worked for the government, and she bought paintings for the officers, and she commissioned the work, and I felt very wealthy with this money, and thought I'd give art another chance, and applied for workshops. Got into one workshop called the Tupelo Workshop in Cape Town. And the venue for this 2-week workshop, which is basically artists from around the world at different points in their career, sharing one space and sharing experience and knowledge, and having an intensive creative experience together. It's at the end of this workshop, which was, the venue was the Sproul School of Art. The director there then saw my work, and then they offered me a scholarship. And then things got, after studying, I think then that's when I met my gallerist, and very early on after completing my studies, I worked with him, Jonathan. So yeah, that's how I got into it.
It's such an interesting trajectory, but also to hear all these kind of moments of like various hats that you wore before you got to where you are, because actually they kind of make sense in a strange way.
I think the gardening experience over 10 years, and it wasn't just gardening, it was a handyman. So what was good about that was that the people I worked for whatever reason, had a lot of confidence in me, and they would just say, I want you to do this, so figure it out.
Igshaan, I absolutely understand that feeling of having a lot of confidence in you. Like we actually, before we actually even spoke about this in conversation today, I was just like explaining, you have such a gentle demeanor, but it really commands something. It commands a certain energy. But yeah, it's interesting as well hearing that you actually had this interest in hospitality as an example, because there's something about your practice which has, it's actually a very warm space, even though you speak about a lot of very difficult issues in your work or in your practice, and things that are actually very, very hard sometimes to digest emotionally or psychologically. There's something very inviting, I think, about the environments that you create, and I really hope that our audiences will actually see that at the Hayward.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that was a very clear choice I made right from the beginning, is that, of course I was, there were other artists around me, and there was all these kind of conversations we used to have back then about whether or not the artist should be explicit in what they are trying to convey, whether or not it should be open to interpretations and things like that. But I very clearly made that choice that I wasn't going to be in your face kind of attacking a subject matter because I felt like that was being done. But I realized that one could disarm people with beauty and texture and all these things. And then without preaching, one can then slip in these kind of important issues that I have to live with and deal with constantly in my daily life and have in the past. And I imagine other people do too. And so, yeah, that was my approach, a soft approach.
I mean, you've talked about this kind of relationship of craft, which has been there from the beginning, but why weaving in particular, and why do you feel like it's the medium in which, you're able to say things that maybe otherwise you can't?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I would say that I'm a painter to begin with. That's how I entered the art space as an oil painter. And I started out with painting very realistic kind of portraits and, very traditional landscapes and still life. Before I was introduced to the more conceptual inside. So I feel like my approach to weaving remains that of a painter. So I feel like when I weave, I mix paints on the loom by using these multicolored rope and beads. And the way we mix the beads certainly is like mixing spices or paint itself, your pigments together, before we string them up and then it becomes the material we weave with. So the reason for weaving, I would say, firstly, I worked at a place in Kailicha. It's a township called Pilani. The place is called Pilani, the NGO. And my job there was to work with the mothers of these the center was for the malnourished kids of the very poor communities. And they eventually realized that they needed to empower the mothers. So they created an employment project where they taught the women to do weaving and silkscreen printmaking. And then when I arrived, I taught them painting on this collaborative kind of practice. So it was important for me to learn to weave so I can best help them. So the women, they actually taught me to weave, at least taught me how to begin and to start the carpet and end it off. I was able to weave. I remember as a kid trying to mimic the baskets that we got from these woven baskets we used to exchange for old clothes. And I often try to mimic that weaving, make my own baskets or placemats or things like that. And so I was always drawn to that. I think initially, when you stand in front of a massive loom, this empty loom with the intention to weave, it's incredibly daunting, because there's so much labor involved in having to achieve this goal. And so I think I just really liked that. To me, at the beginning, felt like an impossibility in a way, like this is just craziness to want to do this. And so I really liked that idea of having to push myself mentally, because it really was a mental thing. It's this mental thing that I cannot do this, that I was interested in stepping over. So, but then of course, weaving itself, it's like one of the first technologies that we as human beings have invented, right? It has such a long history, but it also just has so much meaning in terms of wanting to piece together a very complex identity using all these different ideas and materials that the method itself kind of allows for that kind of mashup of materials and ideas.
Yeah, it's kind of a really interesting space where kind of literally multiple threads exist in one frame, and that's what's so kind of like dynamic about your work. It almost feels like living painting or living sculpture in a way. Like it constantly has a texture, which I think, just feels like it lives and breathes so much, because you can't quite capture everything in one glance as well, or in one look, or in one sitting. And your choice of materials is something that's so interesting that I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about for our audience today.
Sure. I mean, so I use this very particular rope, first of all, I would say, and it probably makes up the bulk of the material. And this rope I find it interesting in that it's never repeated really. So there's a big rope making company in South Africa. Oh, I'm not in South Africa, sorry, but in South Africa, in Cape Town, where they make rope for all the different industries, and they all very much specialized rope, you know, kind of heat resistant or whatever, all these different things. But what they do is all the off-cut material after they've completed their orders, instead of throwing it away, they throw it back into the machine, and they make this kind of braided rope with multiple colors and multiple types of strands of material that they sell as recycled rope. And what I love about it is that within one bale, within one coil of rope, it is very clear the kind of different off-cut materials and colors, because you can see how these colors and the combination of colors changes as you unwind this bobbin of rope. So there's a really nice element of discovery in itself, you know, something deep in this kind of bale that I loved. But I kind of came onto this rope, or when I was trying to research how to unravel the prayer rugs and make my own thread so that I could weave with it. And that was my initial intention, really, because at the time I was working with the prayer rugs as my main medium. And I wanted to, you know, the Islamic prayer rugs, and making these installations, which were very much holy spaces. So I had all these rugs that I wanted to unravel and recreate. But that in itself became impossible, because the machines, they wouldn't let me introduce my own material, and the amount I needed, it would take forever to kind of hand spin and things. And so they had this rope already, which is really, I guess, visually what I imagined this would be. And I just loved it for what it was. With of course, the rope in itself, again, it has its own meanings, you know, the rope, and enough rope to hang yourself with, but also just the strength of it, you know, the fact that it's you can't really break it. And then of course I use a lot of beads. Now the beads itself have so much meaning. Of course, there's a lot of embellishment and adornment, which speaks to the domestic space and this obsession. I felt in my childhood, my family had this strange obsession of adorning the facade of the house so that people have a certain impression, but once you move beyond a certain point, and that was always very interesting, this kind of ability to manipulate people's perception with a facade, with an embellishment, with you know, decoration. So I like that. But then beads, in my own practice as a Muslim, I also use the beads, the tasbih, similar to a rosary. And the type of bead that I use, which is also the round bead, is more those types of beads that is typically used on the tasbih or the rosary. That shaped bead, the round shaped bead. And of course, I mean, in South Africa, beads in itself, it's not the same beads that is typically used by the Xhosa or the Zulu people and their ceremonies and everything that it means to them. I've not used those particular beads, but in general, beads take on a whole new meaning within South Africa, just in general, you know. But we've also, of course, mixed in the beads with other things like shells and gemstones, and I've used bones that were turned into beads, and anything, really, all kinds of metal trinkets or chains, and anything really that is associated with the body and adornment.
Yeah.
And then we mix fabric, and typically also just cotton that is from the home, you know, fabrics that you would find on your upholstering, your furniture and curtains, and so very much a home feel to the fabrics.
Yeah, it's got this kind of very exhilarating sensibility to it, that the idea of something from your everyday life, actually, that you or I might completely disregard, that's around you, little metal trinkets, little beads, an old necklace, actually can have something so surprising and revealing about it.
That's exactly the point, and that's the challenge that I find exciting too, is to take this very mundane object that we all recognize or familiar with, but kind of seeing, is there a way that this thing can become more than what it was ever intended to be, if that makes sense, and it is possible because through technology, through a manipulation of the fabrics, but also through the matching it with other things that brings out the best in it, if that so just kind of putting it next to something that helps it say something.
Mm.
I think it's those that I'm looking for, that taking the thing that was never meant to be anything and making it exceptional, extraordinary.
I love that you really referenced kind of how you were sort of born in this through painting, because I remember the first time no, maybe not the first time actually, sorry, the second time we met, and I wasn't aware of this, but you had a catalogue with some of your very early portraits. And I think, and it's kind of really interesting that you went from portraiture and landscape work, because in a way you retain some very similar sensibilities, actually.
Yes, it
You,
becomes, yes. It is still portraits, in other words. It
mm,
remains a portrait of a family, or it's a portrait of a community, the pathways. There is still that element of portraiture, although not so overt. But certainly it documents and speaks of a people, a person's life. And yeah, it's taken maybe, hopefully, a deeper kind of level to the idea of a portrait.
yeah, I mean, it also like feels so infinite in a way, doesn't it? Like I wonder at what point, because it's like the works that you do relate so closely to your life, but also have a kind of a universality about them, and that they have their narrative that you can pull from them, that everyone can relate to in so many ways, like the emotions of it, but also kind of wider socio-political histories, especially where we are right now. One can
Yeah.
really especially understand those, and it feels like the medium that you've chosen. I know I don't know if you feel like this, but for me, I feel like there's almost no limitation to what it can offer in a way.
I have kind of really, I haven't done, I didn't want to go and study weaving. I didn't
Mm,
want to go study techniques, existing techniques. I used the most basic technique, which is also actually used by some Native American tribes. And it's the most basic idea of, you have the string, and the rope goes in the back and the front and the back, and
mm,
it's just a really basic concept of weaving. But I love that because within that basic, I then can play around and say, well, what happens if I not take that path? I take the opposite, or what happens if I don't weave this way like it's supposed to, but I take this thread and just jump it to the
mm,
front, just what happens, because within that basic, there's more scope then. Because what happens if at some point we took an entire burglar bar from a window, a big burglar bar, and forced it into the loom and then wove that, like a heavy cast iron metal
oh
thing,
my goodness.
framework. Or I've done works, so within the basic, certainly we experiment and we play with different things, materials, or what happens when you actually weave an object in there.
Mm.
We had chairs in the loom. That one didn't work out, but it was fun.
That sounds fascinating, I have to say.
Uh,
Uh,
so you're right. I certainly feel that way. There's an infinite possibility, and it's exciting to continue to play and experiment with other things that could possibly work, or that's
mm,
not supposed to work, but make it work.
mm. But you've really, you have a really sort of expansive and very inventive take on weaving anyway. You move from so many different, you take the weave and you apply it in so many unique kind of ways, whether it's kind of deconstructing the format of a prayer rug in your tapestries, or it's actually creating something that sits quite architectural,
Yeah.
which is actually the kind of project that you created for the Hayward, as well as some really interesting, very dimensional sculptural works that are made with metal and with beading, and move away from this kind of softness of your tapestries.
Yeah, for sure. I think what I like is the position between chaos and order. Because if you think
Mm,
about it, weaving really is just a kind of an ordering, kind of ordering of material in a particular way. where the sculptures, what you're talking about is the opposite of that. It's entanglement, right? It's the unweaving, the undoing of that, and then how those threads then are entangled afterwards. So it sits between the making and the unmaking, and that kind of loop between those 2 points.
That's so
For me, that's
interesting.
how.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if actually we could maybe just talk a little bit about your upcoming show at the Hayward, just to give people a bit of an idea as to what to expect in our galleries. But as this will also live on the internet long after we're probably both gone, it would be nice as well just to hear from, in your words, about the project and what you were inspired with as you conceived it.
Absolutely. I mean, so as you know, and in the way it all played out, it wasn't the intention initially to have this show. It was always just going to be a smaller show, and the pandemic came with certain blessings, I would say, which is this. But the way we conceived it, I've been working with this linoleum. So the works on the wall for the Hayward exhibition, the work there. I think we have 8, was it 8?
8, yeah.
8 tapestries on the wall. And of course, these tapestries are all what I consider documents, or it's encodings of the floor, or the linoleum floor cover that people use in their homes, and how that floor had kind of worn out over time, and the pathway that had been created, kind of depicting where furniture had been placed and how people had moved in that space. And so each of these floor coverings become very unique in that way. And so it is unique to that family. Then I come and we exchange the linoleum for new linoleum. And of course, it's important that we make sure that the people we get the linoleum from, they feel like they've benefited. So I would like to make the point that we make sure that they not only get really good quality linoleum, but they also compensated financially, and they feel good about the transaction. So I don't just feel like I'm going in there taking, and these are also just all people in my own environment that I grew up in, friends and family and community members, people I've always known. The spaces we draw from are spaces that I know intimately, Those, of course, become documents that I do take, I try and filter the information I get in those homes and try and come up with my own interpretation of that. And the first intention, of course, is to make them beautiful. So in that way, they become precious and worth kind of archiving, worth holding on to. They become more than what they started out as. So the aesthetic value of it is important to me. But then, we try and kind of highlight the information that had been worn away, so the information that had been removed, so the pattern or the color or how the sun has bleached it. Often we incorporate those elements into the work. And so for the Hayward exhibition, we started out with these domestic documents, as I say, or domestic spaces. But of course, I wanted to take it a step further. I wanted to see what would be the next level or next idea of this. And through a discussion with, during my residency at A4, actually, I started looking at the desire lines. It was actually in a discussion with a colleague at, it was Josh. And he was relating the idea of a desire line and what that meant in urban planning. So a desire line really is these pathways that are created over time by a community, and really is, if you think about it, how a space is planned out, like the planner imagined that people would use the space a certain way, pedestrians would walk. But of course, there are people that these shortcuts are created, and then there's the evidence in the pathway, right? One idea there, I always like to think about, there must have been the first person who took that route, right? So there was a pathway to begin with.
The person that forged the way, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what we are actually talking about in the writing of one of the books we're producing at the moment. That first person who took that new path. So yeah, I was kind of focusing on then not just like I said, a portrait, like when we're talking about the idea of a portrait, it's not just a portrait of a family, but then the community itself, right? And so the entire lines offered that opportunity. For the Hayward exhibition, we also then focused on in this in-between space. So with the craziness of apartheid, of course, they used highways to keep communities separate from each other. And it was very effective. At least that's what I would always say and thought. And that's also partly why I did that exhibition with all these different sheets of linoleum pulled from different homes and kind of put together as these different stories in one. Because I was trying to address this issue of these two communities next to each other that are kind of completely alienated from each other because of the history. Being, me being Cape Colored, having been classified as a second-class citizen, but then you have like next door to Nick Pontiero is Langa, which would have been a black community, and they would have been classified as third class. And because of that classification in itself created that animosity. Of course, the colored people think we're better than, as you can imagine that these mental things. And so I wanted to pick up this issue because it really does bother me. It is really painful to witness. So what I focused on was this in-between space between the highway, between Pontiero and Langa. There's one highway, the one going one way, one going this way. And then in between is this piece of land, this grassland. And what I loved about that pathways then was that it is obviously evidence that people do actually cross the highway, that there is this crossover of this boundary. And for whatever reason, it's probably not always positive reasons. People go and look for drugs or whatever, but there is a crossover of this boundary. And so we really focused on that space. I took Google Maps and took an aerial image of the pathway. We then cut out the center where the two pathways intersect, and then just took a little rectangular square of that landscape. But the problem we had there was we couldn't do it the same way we would have done it with the linoleum. We couldn't just go in there and trace out the pathway that had happened over time and the pattern and then use that drawing as the template for the weaving. In this case, it became a lot more, it wasn't possible really in the actual environment. And so we had to use Google Maps. But I still wanted this feeling of I wanted the ground. And so I devised this way of, first we used a large sheet of paper, kind of 1-to-1, the actual size that I was dealing with, and it's 18 meters by 6 meters, so quite a large piece. We used a large piece of paper, and I actually used a mop and some ink and paints and different things, and we devised this method of dancing with the mop and finding this rhythmic way of making marks on the paper, really in the same way, well, basically where the grass would have still remained, and we kept the pathway itself as a blank paper space, right? And this method then allowed me to create all the movement that I needed to have within the template before it was woven. And it was just really a fun experience, to be honest.
Yeah.
To make marks on this large sheet of paper and create this feeling of ground, And so when it came to the weaving itself and the combinations of materials and the textures and the thing, we really wanted to have some interpretation of ground, which is clear and visible as you see it. And I would also say that this is like the most complex and mix of materials that I've ever used. I've never used so many different materials in one work at a time. It was really a lot of different things, well, we had to also because of the absolute scale of the work and the amount of materials we needed to finish the work. We had to, but and so there was a lot of kind of having to just make it work as we moved along.
Yeah. It does feel like a very like it was quite interesting, I think, especially seeing some of the images that you'd taken on your field research, Igshaan, and actually how you kind of captured like splashes of color on a very like barren, dry earth, and actually how that's so visible in the weave that you've done. Like it's, you know, with distance, it does have this very earthy greens, like browns, ochre colors. But then when you come up close, you see again these kind of very surprising moments, which actually is very real in a way, which sort of take you off guard a little bit. But it's really, yeah, it's really interesting. I'm so excited actually because you know, of course, these works are now sitting in the gallery, ready to be installed when Igshaan comes on site, and actually planning this exhibition like virtually is one thing, but actually having that physicality and that tactility is going to be really exciting.
It is a very tactile exhibition, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, with the exhibition, of course, with these pathways, I was just to add in on top of the actual woven. So just to be clear, first of all, that the way we've woven it is by weaving the grass patches that had not been worn out by the pathway, and the actual pathway itself then becomes exposed gallery floor, right? And in that way, we invite the viewer to walk the actual path that other people's at work. So it's a complete transplant of a real landscape, at least a copy of that landscape. But of course, I wanted to add another element to it, and a sculptural element to the weaving. And so I thought, I kind of really thought through this idea. Obviously, the whole exhibition now relates to feet movement, the ground, and the moving of material, moving material around, right? So the things kind of move, not visibly, but things move as is evident in the way pathways are created over time. And it's in that idea that I started thinking about the dust clouds, you know. So when I was younger, my grandparents, they are from Namaqualand, which is the Northern Cape, just south of Namibia. And they are from the Nama tribe, and they spoke a certain language. But I remember when, as kids, we used to drive up there annually to go and see the flowers. You know, they have these fields of beautiful flowers, the wildflowers. And I remember the dance they used to do up there. It's called the real dance, and this dance it's performed by like teenagers or youngsters, and there's a humorous element to it because they all dress up as these older people, and they dance as couples, but also synchronized as a few different couples. And so within this, what I remember most about the dance is the point of the dance is to kick the dust as they are moving their feet, and they certainly look for a very dusty kind of plane to perform this dance on. So as you are dancing, they are kicking the dust up, and it creates this beautiful kind of halo of dust around the figures as they move in this cloud of dust. And it's that visual that in my head that I base the sculptural kind of clouds that will be hovering above this floor piece. At least my own interpretation using the materials that I have been using to interpret this feeling of a dust cloud, but with the absence of the figures, you know.
Yeah, it's wonderful actually, because I think, you know, what the gallery will really feel like is a full topography, you know, with kind of like sky above, ground below, and that sense of movement that you've created as you move through things. I think that awareness of your body within a shifting environment, I think, will feel really palpable. But thank you, Igshaan, for that beautiful introduction to your show at the Hayward, for being beyond our wildest dreams of such an incredible artist to work with. It's been a long process, as you've highlighted at the beginning, getting here, working through a very challenging pandemic, some very challenging circumstances, but you've put so much care and attention and love into the show, and it's really going to show. So I'm just really grateful to you and to your team who've been incredible, and to our Hayward team, especially to Marie Charlotte, who's been
Yes,
a
thank you, everybody.
big teammate in this. So just a very, very big thank you. All right. Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
for having me, and thank you for everybody for listening to my stories.